Although it is called the witch house, it is actually a house that was used to hold witch trials by a hanging judge named Jonathan Corwin during the Salem Witch Trials of 1692, one of the most famous cases in America. The trial began when a young girl in the village began to have convulsions, screaming, and complaining about being stabbed by needles and pain in her body. Several other girls followed, all shouting incoherent words. Since people at that time had only basic knowledge of biology, medicine, and psychology, it was concluded that the 3 children were cursed by a witch. Thus, the witch hunt began. The townspeople were afraid and suspicious of each other. They all tried to identify the witch to exonerate themselves. In total, more than 100 people were arrested and charged with witchcraft. All of them were tortured into confessing or had to implicate others to exonerate themselves. In total, 19 people were convicted of witchcraft and executed by hanging. Until the case reached the governor, a new investigation was conducted. In May 1693, all of the people tried were found not guilty, and was released. By the end of March, no one who was accused of being a witch was imprisoned. The Salem Witch Trials were finally closed. But the atmosphere in this house still has traces of suffering. Of those who were wrongly accused and died unjustly. When talking about witches, people in this era may think of young witches wearing cloaks, casting spells with magic wands, casting spells that can do all sorts of things. But for Americans, the word witch will bring to mind one of the most depressing historical events known as the Salem Witch Trials that took place between 1692 to 1693, or about 300 years ago. The witch hunt operation therefore began by having children identify suspects. Some said that the priest used a method of coercing women who did not fit in well with society, starting with Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, Sarah Osborne, an old woman who was sick and did not go to church, and Tituba, a black slave woman from Barbados who was accused of teaching witchcraft and used black magic. After that, the children began to name the girls in the town one by one. The investigators began to visit each house. The townspeople were afraid and suspicious of each other. They all pointed out the witches to exonerate themselves. Later, people used the witch hunt as a tool to accuse and eliminate people who were different from them, vagrants, and even people who hated each other. In total, more than 100 people were arrested and charged with being witches. There were both women and men who they thought were involved. A special court was set up specifically for this trial, using the English law in the New England colonies, which stipulated that being a witch was a serious crime. Another horrifying torture method is to lie down and gradually place stones on their chests. In particular, Giles Corey, a wealthy farmer, was sentenced to death by this method because he refused to confess to using witchcraft with his wife. In the end, he died, and his wife was hanged. After that, Corey's vast assets were seized and divided among the jury and judges of the town. In total, 19 people were convicted of being witches and executed by hanging on Gallows Hill. 5 people, including a baby, died in prison, not to mention the many others who were tortured to death. The matter reached Governor William Phipps, who ordered the suspension of the special courts and established a new Supreme Court of Judicature instead. He also prohibited the use of evidence called the evidence of dreams and visions, spectral evidence, was used. The Supreme Court convicted only 3 defendants out of 56 people. Phipps pardoned all 3 and 5 prisoners awaiting execution. By May 1693, all the people tried were found not guilty and released. By the end of March, no one accused of being a witch was imprisoned. The Salem Witch Trials were finally closed. Later, the accused in the Salem Witch Trials were revived and defended. Until 1706, and Putnam, one of the 3 girls who had accused many people from the beginning, confessed that she had lied and given false witness, claiming that it was all a temptation from Satan. In 1711, the Massachusetts government passed an amnesty law and canceled the results of the witch trials that had taken place in 1692. The legislature then passed a law to absolve those convicted and sentenced to death and to pay compensation to all their descendants. Today, Salem is alive and well. It is a center of a gathering place for those who love the occult and various kinds of magic. It turns out that the city that once hunted witches in the past has flourished into a real witch town that attracts tourists continuously, especially at the city's cemetery, which has a memorial to the 1692 witch hunt, a lawn with 19 trees planted to represent those who were executed by hanging, next to the cemetery. The townspeople and merchants here dress in period costumes to match the atmosphere. There are nighttime ghost story tours for those interested in walking through the cemetery, the old execution ground, and there is also a large witch festival held during Halloween.